Hey Salesforce Hubs, welcome back to Codeforce Chronicles, the channel where we do not chase shortcuts, we engineer durability. Before we begin, if Salesforce architecture, interview readiness, and real world execution matters to you, like this episode, share it with one Salesforce professional who still writes triggers like scripts, subscribe because consistency beats virality in long-term careers. Now, let's begin. My name is Shruti MN, Salesforce consultant with 5.5 years experience of industry experience, coach and content creator as a paramount with more than 5.5 years, and today we are discussing a transition that quietly determines who scales and who stalls in Salesforce. And I want to quote the network interferences as a barrier and as a paramount in the itineraries. Welcome to the podcast series where triggers to trigger frameworks, moving from scripts to structure, helps you to understand the vertical. Not admin versus developer, not flow versus apex, but something far more fundamental, moving from writing triggers to engineering trigger frameworks. The problem nobody talks about is, and answer it honestly in the questions. Have you ever written a trigger that worked flawlessly in Sandbox? And I want you to answer this question as a paramount and not as a reference to the identicals which are quoted to us. Past all the unit tests, I want to quote this as a reference that I am a Salesforce coach and consultant, and I want my Salesforce hub to increase the confidence and not the itinerary as a community. Now, when we speak about the community in the velocity which we quote as a community, that is Salesforce hubs, and then the collapsed under a data load is quoted as a reference. If yes, pause the video and type yes in the comments. No judgment, just awareness. Because here's the truth. You didn't write bad code. You wrote scripted logic instead of structured logic. Scripted triggers assume low entropy, few records, predictable execution, order, single business path. But production orgs operate under high entropy, bulk imports, parallel integrations, async reentries, unpredictable execution context. This is where scripts fail and frameworks survive in the context that we quote as a reference. Trigger scripts versus trigger frameworks. And I want to congratulate my subscribers, that is Ananya R, a Salesforce admin with 4 and above years of experience in the FSI domain. Karthik S, Salesforce developer in a product company. Megha P, HR business partner in IT hiring company as a recruiter. And the designations which I'm quoting should be quoted as a reference to my entity. And the feedback which I've provided related to the interview process in Capgemini, TCS, and even Cognizant is quoted as a reference to me, even as a feedback from the entrepreneurs who are quoted as a reference to my entity. Rohit V, senior Salesforce architect in a consulting company. It is quoted as a reference to me, and the name of the company will be quoted as an itinerary in the upcoming videos where I will quote the sessions as a paramount and not as an identity. I want my references to be quoted to the leaders of Salesforce, especially Arundhati Bhattacharya, for quoting her reference in her recent communication, and I want the network interferences to be quoted as a comment or a barrier in the paramount as a reference which will be quoted even in future. Neha A, technical recruiter in an enterprise accounts company where we can quote the references as a paramount, and I quote this as a reference to the feedback which I've received. And the community feedback edition, that is this questionnaire, will be quoted as a reference to you in the upcoming sessions as well. and I want the references to be quoted as a graded formality and not as a paramount in the level of execution of the optimization. The first question which the audience wants me to question the authority and not the identity in the vertical is, why is bulkification considered a correctness principle or a mechanism through which you can correct the references rather than a performance optimization in Salesforce? Now, when it comes to the performance optimization or the references which is quoted to us, I can quote the reference as a paramount and not as a reference in the identity. I will explain the scenario by using the paramount as a reference, and I want the interruptions even in the vertical to be quoted as a reference to me even in future, and I want my viewers to quote the references to me by encouraging your friends to be part of my curriculum, that is the coaching center which I am hosting as a reference to the recruiting formalities, which will be quoted as a reference again, that I wouldn't place my reference as a placement. That means I wouldn't place the guaranteed response related to the interviews which you will clear, and as a reference to the companies which I am quoting, especially Capgemini, should be quoted as a reference to the identicals which I am quoting in the curriculum, which I will circulate after you register your formality as a reference to the curriculum and not as a reference to the identity. Now I want you to understand the vertical. If I place a reference and I quote the reference as data A, then B, then C. And I want the references to be quoted as, and I want the audience to answer these questions based on the curriculum which you're part of. If you're a Salesforce admin, you have to quote it as a reference to the developer. Salesforce platform. That is, if you're using triggers, then it is after update functionality, which will be quoted as a reference. Now, when we speak about the references which is quoted as a paramount, then we can quote the itineraries to be referred to as data manipulation in the DML statements. That is, insert and update functionality to be quoted as a after update reference as a context, and the developer or the architect should quote the reference as for each loop with the identity, that is the object, which is quoted as a reference to the master detail relationship. Now, if I've quoted the reference in a statement, I want the audience to understand that the master detail relationship should be quoted as a reference even in the formulated evidence, that is the lead to opportunity to be quoted as a reference, and the junction object or the teacher to courses with the formulated evidence, that is the attendance object to be quoted as a reference to the master-detail relationship. And I want the references to be quoted as an itinerary after we perform the updates. And the references should be quoted as a vertical and not as a curriculum in this itinerary. I want my reference, that is the curriculum which we quote, as a paramount, and I want you to take the screenshot of this reference as a vertical. How does a trigger framework reduce architectural risk compared to a single trigger script? Now, when we quote these references as a paramount, we should understand the vertical. And I'm a trained Salesforce architect with the curriculum, Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Education Cloud, Finance Cloud as a research and paper to education, finance and health cloud in the medium, which I quote as a reference. And the curriculum which I'm working on is related to the statements which I was conducting as a surveillance when I was part of an organization, and I quote it as a reference to my conduct, that is India Private Limited, as a curriculum which was not part of Salesforce, but I grew in my life as a Salesforce architect after I quoted my reference to Procera Analytics, and now the reference is quoted as Inspire XT Consulting as a reference to the organizations which are quoted as a partnered company with the terminologies that we use as a reference. And now I'm working as a Salesforce coach, holding myself as a parameter in Codeforce Chronicles with the references quoted as a freelancing persona in the vertical. And now when I read these scripts, I feel that the scripts should be generated according to the references which are quoted to us. When it comes to the research which are conducted related to the medications which we quote as a test or a reference which we quote as a parameter, and then the phase that is to release the medication to be quoted as a reference to the paramount, which I quote myself as a reference to IQVIA, or the reference as a affiliates to Sanjay India Private Limited, and the partnered company IQVIA should to be quoted as a reference in my life. I want trigger scripts versus trigger frameworks to be quoted as a reference. Let's delineate this cleanly. Trigger script. Logic embedded directly in the trigger. Conditionals intervened with DML. Context-specific assumptions. Works until requirements evolve. So when it comes to a script which you write as a reference to the vertical, I want my notes to be quoted as a reference and not as a medium through which you can quote your paramount in the itinerary. And I want this to be quoted as a reference under the review mechanism, and I wish that the context which I am quoting can help you to grow as an embedded formality. That is the trigger frameworks that we use, or the framework that we use as a mechanism, should be quoted as a logic. And I want the mechanism to be quoted as the interruption in the proficiency. Logic in the data, or the DML statements, which is quoted as insert and update statements. The trigger framework can be quoted as intentionally thin trigger and delegated handler classes. To be quoted as the vertical, that is recursion, and the page upload. explicit separation of concerns. Now, when it comes to the handler and the classes which we quote as a reference to the method, with sharing should be quoted as a reference, and I want you to make a note of the updates by taking the screenshot if you feel that the concerns which are quoted is explicitly, and I want my reference to be quoted as a mechanism and not as a concern. Concerns to be quoted as a reference to the governor limit. And I want my reference to be quoted as a reference to the previous context and not as a reference to this prodigy where I am writing the limitation as the governor limit. With socle as a limitation designed for unknown future states, that is, the future states will be quoted as a boundary with the mechanism. A trigger framework is not about verbosity, it's about responsibility boundaries. As Dan Appelman has repeatedly articulated, assume everything is bulk, because one day it will be. Frameworks assume scale by default, not as an afterthought. Why this determines career trajectory? Here's an uncomfortable but necessary insight which can be quoted as a reference to the third mechanism, that is, explain how governor limits influence apex design decisions in enterprise orgs. Most Salesforce professionals do not plateau because they lack syntax. They plateau because they do not evolve their mental models. That is, enterprise interviews in Capgemini, TCS, Accenture do not ask, can you write a trigger? They ask, how does this behave when 5,000 records are updated through an integration pipeline? Framework thinking proficiency can be quoted as a reference, and the notes should be quoted as a paramount in the references, which I will quote as a proficiency in the category. And I want the vertical to be quoted again as a paramount and not as a vertical in the itineraries, which I will quote even in future. So I request you to focus on the updates and not as a reference in the proficiency. Architectural maturity can be quoted as a reference to the vertical, that is risk anticipation. And the references can be quoted as a paramount after we understand the organizational benefits. When would you prefer queuable apex over at future methods, and why? Long-term ownership and leadership readiness should be quoted as a reference and not as a medium through which we can quote the reference as a medium. And I want the interferences to be quoted as a mechanism if you're not able to paraphrase the conference. This is the inflection point where admins and developers work together, and developers and architects work together. The 5,000 plus record reality check can be quoted as a reference and as a paramount in the future methods which can be quoted. How do sets and maps contribute to deterministic behavior under large data volumes? I want this to be quoted as a reference to the fourth proficiency, which I've quoted as add future methods, and the reason with the conference, which can be quoted as a vertical, where we can use SOQL queries, and the reference to be quoted as a parameter in the fifth vertical, that is sets and maps, to be quoted as a reference, where the requirement when contacts are updated, update the field on the parent account to be quoted as a reference to the reality versus the parameter which I'm quoting. Straightforward until we quote the reference as 5000 contacts updated through data loader while an integration executes concurrently. Script response can be quoted as a strategy which can be referred to in the sixth itinerary, that is what strategies do you use to prevent recursion in complex trigger executions, and the reference can be quoted as a parameter in the vertical, and again the reference can be quoted as a scripted response of SOQL query. SOQL inside loops, DML per record, can be quoted as a reference, and as a paraphrase to the previous itinerary, the governor limits are breached with the org instability as a reference. Now, framework driven response, aggregate account IDs into a set, and query once can be quoted as a reference to the for each loop, and the iteration loop in the vertical which we quote, that is the for loop, and update once can be quoted as a reference to the stateless deterministic execution in the vertical, that is parameter which we quoted as match intersects, which is a async process. And I want my references to be quoted to the organization which I'm part of. The difference is not brilliance, it's discipline. And I quote my coaching center with admin, developer and advanced developer courses for rupees 3,000 and 5,000 as a vertical, that is live session for rupees 5,000 and self-paced courses for rupees 3,000 as a reference to my identical, that is my number, which is 805003307, or you can forward your queries to shrutinarsi@gmail.com. Framework thinking beyond apex can be quoted as a reference to the vertical, where you can quote the narrations as a strategic movement. What strategies do you use to prevent recursion and complex trigger execution has been handled by the execution and not as a paramount. How would you explain execution context to a non-technical stakeholder? And you can quote the framework thinking beyond apex as a paramount and not as an itinerary. Important clarification: lean in. Framework thinking is not exclusive to apex. In flows, structure manifests as 0 DML inside loops, assignment elements for aggregation. And I want the separation to be quoted as a stakeholder not as a separation between the non-technical expertise. And now I want the reference to be quoted to the audience who are trying to refer their statements, especially urgent, to be quoted as a reference with the paramount, and the references which are quoted as a paramount even in my subscriptions to be quoted as a reference in the identical. And now the separation between the two identicals can be quoted as a reference and not as a paramount. Why is separation of concerns critical in long-term Salesforce maintenance can be quoted as a reference to the addition which is spring and winter can be quoted as a reference in the itinerary and not as a reference in the paramount. And if we quote the references again, we can quote the references as a separation with the critical functionality and not as a forbearance in the mechanism, that is LWC, and integration as a paramount in the recursion, that is a page upload with the reactive functionality, and LST to be used as a reference and not as a mechanism. Decision logic separated from actions. If we quote this as a reference to the vertical, how do you balance declarative automation with programmatic control? Or it can be quoted as a reference to the itinerary and not as a reference to the profile or the portfolio, which is quoted as a reference. Now when it comes to profile and the permissions, which we quote as a reference, I want the declarative automation to be quoted as a narration and not as a update. A single update element at termination. Declarative or programmatic. Structure outperforms cleverness. Or structure outperform cleverness can be quoted as a reference and not as a paramount in this itinerary. Automation without structure is silent, technical death. Now, when we quote our references to the itineraries, what signals interviewers that a developer thinks like an architect. When we quote the itineraries as signals, it is the inheritance, that is the alerts or the references that we quote as a paramount and not as a warning. And when we use the error mechanism, which we quote as a narration, we can add the references to the insight which Deepika Khanna ma'am has given as a reference in the proficiency, or the provided statement should be Deepika Khanna, a YouTuber, and as a itinerary in the reference, a perspective I internalized from my mentor Deepika Khanna. So the reference should be quoted as an internalized platform and not as a vertical. Write automation as if someone else will inherit as at scale, and not does this work today, but will this remain coherent under change. When we speak about the references which is quoted as an architect, we have to answer the reference that the developer thinks with an itinerary and not as a process, which will be quoted as a procedural interference in the mechanism, that is the after insert and update to be quoted as a delete option when we quote the narration as a hard delete. How do you design automation assuming integration and async re-entries? By using the upgrades on how the triggers, flows, LWCs, validation logic is quoted as a reference and not as an entry in the parameter, that is the loop which we use as a reference. What clarifying questions would you ask before implementing trigger logic? And I conclude this reference as what Salesforce leadership reiterates. A recurring message from Salesforce leadership in India: the future Salesforce professional is not a tool expert but a systems thinker. Trigger frameworks embody systems thinking, predictable, explainable, scalable. And the automation should be quoted as an employability in 2026 as a reference to the segmentation. And the questions which we can ask as a questionnaire is: if the logic is used as an implementation and the paramount is quoted as a reference, the trigger recursion mechanism, that is the maps to be used as a reference, then what are the strategic movements that we can quote as a reference to the ideology that we quote as a paraphrase in the direction and not as a mechanism. Second, if we quote the trigger logic as a reference and the questions which are quoted as a reference in the methodology, after we provide the substantial evidence, that is the mechanism, then the execution should be quoted as a reference and not as a proficiency in the itinerary. Third, if we quote the reference as an itinerary, and I'm Quoting this as a reference to the interruptions in the mechanism, I want the references to be quoted as a comment. As a reference to the ideology, I want the reference that is quoted as a paramount in the question. That is, if the references are quoted as an itinerary, then the paraphrased version should be quoted as a reference and not as an implementation. If you question this to the developer who's quoted you as a reference, then you can learn the sessions which we quote as a reference even in my curriculum as a forwarded statement. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment with flow if declarative automation resonates with you, apex if programmatic control is your domain, your most complex automation scenario, and honestly, if you ever unsubscribe, comment why. This channel improves through feedback, not illusions, which will be quoted as a reference even in future. Courses, community, and the closure formalities. If you are serious about mastering admin fundamentals, developer reasoning, architectural decision making, enroll now to live programs for Rs 5,000 and self-paced programs for Rs 3,000 can be quoted as an itinerary for each fundamental. Call 805000007 as an itinerary to subscribe for weekly podcast tutorials and architecture-driven Salesforce content. Follow me on Instagram with Silent Infusion as a proficiency, Twitter as Shruti Manjam as an inheritance, and LinkedIn with Shruti MN as a proficiency in the itinerary. Triggers are easy. Frameworks demand responsibility, and responsibility, not syntax, defines seniority. Like, share, subscribe. Because careers compound the same way architects do, with intention. Until next time, Salesforce Hubs, let's build systems that scale with integrity, not scripts that fracture under pressure. Thank you.